sympathisers of the pro-Kurdish HDP party, because that is the opposition to the government, and that is why you hear people chanting Erdogan murderer, referring to the president. There is immense anger towards him and to his government at the moment.
Some claims of who might have been responsible for the bombings, but no one really claiming responsibility themselves yet.
No official claim of responsibility, you're right, and no real hard evidence really to say who was behind it. We haven't heard yet of CCTV footage or anything like that showing suspected culprits. The government says that they suspect the hand of so-called Islamic State, and they have compared this to the attack on the predominantly Kurdish city of Suruc in southern Turkey back in July, that they also blamed on Islamic State. That was an attack that left over 30 people dead. But the problem is twofold in a sense. The first is that IS did not actually claim responsibility for that Suruc attack, very unusually, which is why many people doubt their involvement. And second of all, there is simply a huge legacy of mistrust here towards the government. Many people do not believe the government's assertion that it was an IS job. Many people will say that they believe that it was a shady nationalist deep state, as is often called here, that were behind the attacks. And that claim and counterclaim is simply adding to the anger and grief here.
3 weeks until elections in Turkey, Mark, and we have the PKK yesterday declaring a ceasefire and the Turkish military today carrying out airstrikes on them.
Yes, and that shows you just how, in a sense, how vulnerable this country is at the moment. It has the ongoing violence with the PKK, and even though, as you say, there was a declaration that the PKK would halt military operations in Turkey yesterday, that appears not to have been accepted by the government. It's continued airstrikes on PKK positions in northern Iraq. The Deputy Prime Minister dismissed the PKK statement yesterday as an election ploy, but the PKK violence is simply one aspect of a sort of perfect storm that Turkey is facing at the moment.
Our correspondent Mark Lowen with me from Ankara. Lots of stark images still emerging from the attacks themselves, the immediate aftermath, and of the crowds at that memorial moment in Ankara earlier today. You can see much more at bbc.com/news if you'd like to. Now, in Syria, the government says it's making big advances against rebels in the north of the country. Let's talk to our Middle East correspondent, Jim Muir. And this is a result, I presume, Jim, of the Russian airstrikes we've been hearing so much about.
Yes, indeed. It's a combination of things. The Syrian government seems to have got, or regime, if you want to call it that, has got Russia much more strongly on its side. Also, Iran is weighing in more strongly on the ground to supplement Russian air power. So you have more of the Shia militias, some from Iraq, some from Afghanistan, and obviously Hezbollah from Lebanon, all of them Iranian-backed, who are much more prominent in the fighting on the ground, bolstering the Syrian army forces, who are now trying to advance and recapture the ground they lost earlier this year, when the rebels kind of welded together by a new coordination between Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, themselves came together more strongly on the ground and started, as a result, making some quite significant gains, especially in the north, taking the Idlib, the capital of the northwest province there, and related or nearby strategic areas. And so the areas the government is now trying to push back into are the ones they lost in that offensive by the rebels. And of course they are very much helped by softening up on the part of Russian air power, and of course by the help they're getting on the ground from their various allies.
And we know the Russian airstrikes have been opposed by Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Turkey, and the Saudi defense minister has been talking with President Putin today.
Yes, that's a rather remarkable meeting, given the kind of polarization that's taken place and the fact that the Saudis are very clearly on one side. They're in fact backing the rebels on the ground, the non-IS, the non-Islamic State forces, who are taking the main brunt of the Russian intervention. It's my view that that intervention was primarily triggered by the fact that those rebels had been gaining ground and really threatening the core of the regime control areas near the coast and the cities leading towards Damascus. So yes, this meeting between the Saudis and Mr. Putin was very important. There was obviously no enormous meeting of minds, because the Saudis came out saying they are still insisting that Bashar al-Assad has to go, and that is really the key thing, because Bashar al-Assad is not just the president, he's the kingpin, the lynch pole, whatever you want to call it, the tent pole, without which the regime